The origin of life on Earth is an important part of one's worldview. This is because what one thinks of human origins affects how one views other human beings. Unfortunately, the pushing of an atheistic worldview by the scientific establishment has led to a denial of God's involvement as a starting assumption of so-called mainstream origin of life research. The question before us is which of the two possibilities, intelligent design or life made itself from non-life by way of natural processes, is the most reasonable possibility? To do this, we will look at the thermodynamics of the problem and see which fits known principles of thermodynamics the best. Genesis 1:11-13 God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth." And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit whose seed is in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And the evening and the morning were the third day. Genesis 1:20-23 And God said, "Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that has life, the fowl that it may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven." And God created the great whales, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every fowl of the air after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the sea, and let fowl multiply in the earth." And the evening and the morning were the fifth day. Genesis 1:24-25 And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after his kind, and cattle, and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after his kind." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and every living thing that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. Genesis 1:26-27 And God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." And God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. The clear conclusion is that according to the Bible, God created life, and he did so by speaking. He did not create a single cell and let it evolve over time to form plants, animals, and man, though he did create single-celled organisms. He created various kinds of organisms and had them reproduce after their kind, with kind being broader than species, but most equivalent to family or in some cases genus. Abiogenesis is the process by which life is alleged to have arisen from non-living matter. While many theories of abiogenesis have been proposed, none of them have ever been shown to actually produce life. The real drive behind abiogenesis research is the purely atheistic assumption that life had to arise by way of natural causes. While technically abiogenesis is not part of biological evolution in that you don't need abiogenesis for biological evolution to work, abiogenesis is, however, a critical component of the atheistic evolutionary worldview. The main hope of abiogenesis research is to break down the process into steps that make it seem possible and even probable. They are effectively looking for a miracle from natural processes to produce the first living thing. They are then betting on another miracle from evolution to get us from there. Here we take a look at all of the empirical evidence for abiogenesis. Well, that should about do it because there is no empirical evidence for abiogenesis. Over the years, several experiments have been done to try to replicate parts of the alleged process. Despite more than half a century of such experiments, they are still far from anything even close to the simplest living cell. The Mystery experiment started with 3 compounds that at the time were believed by evolutionists to make up the early Earth's atmosphere, along with water. The experiment produced about 2% amino acid, and the remaining 98% consisted largely of tar that is deadly to life. And only a few of the 20 amino acids needed for life were produced, and life cannot exist without all 20 amino acids. For all practical purposes, RNA is a single-strand helix version of DNA. Both encode information in living cells with RNA being used to transport the information. Lincoln and Joyce got an RNA enzyme and RNA to catalyze each other in a continuous cycle. This resulted in the replication of the RNA and exponential growth in the number of RNA molecules, resulting in the claim that life got started with RNA as the information storage medium, known as RNA world. The experiment was carried out in a component-rich environment at constant temperature, a situation which would not occur in nature. Also, the nucleotides of this RNA form a random chain of nucleotides, so they did not encode any complex specific information like that found in the DNA of every living cell. Dr. David Deamer has done experiments to produce synthetic cell membranes from a lipid bilayer. The idea is that this would protect the components needed for life in the outside environment and aid further development. These lipid bilayer vesicles are similar enough to cell walls to cause excitement among evolutionists. Lacking the complex genetic information, molecular machines, and metabolism of living cells, they are nowhere near being life. The ironic goal of the abiogenesis researchers is to use their intelligence to produce life so as to prove that no intelligence was needed to create life in the beginning. The nucleotides of RNA and DNA are found in meteorites. This has been claimed as evidence that these molecules can form naturally. Amino acids have also been found in meteorites. These are the building blocks of proteins. These discoveries have been used as evidence that amino acids form in space. Even if such conclusions are correct, all it shows is that some of the basic components of life can be formed in meteors. Regardless, even if you get all the basic components, it does not a living cell make. You still need to get them together in a living cell, and that is what the real issue is. Now, from a biblical perspective, during the Genesis flood, the eruption of the fountains of the great deep could have carried these components into space. This massive rupture of subterranean water would have torn organisms apart, with some bacteria possibly even surviving to end up on other planetary bodies. Living cells are highly organized, complex systems that consist of numerous molecular machines that produce any number of functions that are indispensable to cellular function and maintenance. Cellular machinery is important to cellular function because they copy, manufacture, and transport. In fact, without them, cells could not repair themselves or reproduce. DNA is not self-replicating, but copying DNA takes several molecular machines that unwind it, separate it, transcribe it, and rewind it. This is just the tip of the cellular machine iceberg. For further illustrations, let's look at a couple of short videos.
In 1957, Francis Crick first proposed that chemicals called bases along the spine of the DNA molecule function as alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. This animation shows how this digital information directs protein synthesis. First, a large protein complex separates the tightly wound strands of the DNA to prepare it to be copied. During this process of transcription, a protein complex called a polymerase produces a single-stranded copy of the original instructions. Here we see this copy, a messenger RNA molecule, being constructed inside the polymerase as individual bases are positioned and added to the growing strand. Now we see the polymerase in action from the outside as it spits out the messenger RNA transcript. Next, this RNA transcript approaches and passes through a molecular machine called the nuclear pore complex, an information recognition device that controls the flow of information in and out of the cell's nucleus. Now we see the genetic assembly instructions on the messenger RNA approaching and arriving at a two-part chemical factory called a ribosome, the site of protein synthesis. As the messenger RNA transcript passes through the ribosome, the process of translation begins. During translation, a mechanical assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids in accord with the instructions on the transcript. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cell by molecules called transfer RNAs, which link specific sequences of bases to corresponding amino acids. The sequential arrangement of amino acids determines the type of protein constructed. When the construction of the chain is complete, it is transported to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape required to perform its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is released into the outer cytoplasm to do its job in the cell.
The result is that living cells have a degree of ordered complexity seen no place else except in the human mind. Such a degree of ordered complexity means that living cells have an extremely low entropy. Since even the simplest known living cell is far more organized and complex than the basic chemical components that make up a cell, a living cell's entropy is much lower than that of their basic chemical components. As a result, forming life from non-living basic chemicals requires a tremendous reduction in entropy. So, any theory on the origin of life must be able to account for this tremendous reduction in entropy. The options boil down to two possibilities. They are abiogenesis, or creation by an intelligence from outside the universe, that is, a supernatural intelligence. The question is, which of these two possibilities best fits the principles of thermodynamics, the totally naturalistic notion of abiogenesis, or a supernatural intelligence? Statistical entropy is the application of probability theory to the thermodynamic principle of entropy. It shows that entropy is related to the amount of disorder in a system by relating entropy to the number of possible ways for a given condition to occur. Disordered systems have more possible ways to occur than ordered systems do. As a result, the more possible ways there are, the more disordered the system is. The fewer possible ways there are, the more ordered the system is. Furthermore, the larger a system's entropy, the more disordered it is, and the smaller a system's entropy, the more ordered it is. However, it does need to be noted that the entropy of a system can increase or decrease if it gets larger or smaller without increasing disorder, but that is not actually relevant to this question. The second law of thermodynamics states that entropy in a closed system always increases. Since the universe qualifies as a closed system, it shows that the universe is running down. The second law of thermodynamics shows that when energy is applied to a system, it can reduce its entropy, but in doing so, it increases the entropy of the environment. It does not, however, show how the way energy is applied to a system affects its entropy. It does not show the difference between construction work and a bomb. Construction work reduces a system's entropy. By contrast, bombs increase the system's entropy. Unfortunately, the second law of thermodynamics does not show the difference. As a result, an additional principle is needed to show this difference. And this principle is also needed to really determine if abiogenesis is possible or not. Reducing entropy and producing order from disorder requires more than just applying energy to a system, but depends on how the energy is applied. When energy is applied in a manner more ordered than the system, it increases the order of that system. When energy is applied in a manner more disordered than the system, it increases the system's disorder. Here is the formula for this principle. Omega E is the number of equivalent combinations of the applied energy, and omega S is the number of equivalent combinations. For the system to which the energy is being applied, Ln is the natural algorithm. Case-Boltzmann's constant, and delta S max is the maximum change in entropy resulting from the application of energy. However, the direction of the change will always be that indicated by delta S max. Here is an illustration of this principle in action. In this case, the starting conditions are right in the middle with an x, y variation of 50. Increase variation and you get increased distance from the target point. Decrease the range from the starting point and the distance closer to the target. Reduce the range of variation to 0 and it is only found at the target. This is because you're focusing on the target. You are effectively applying energy that has a low entropy because the range equivalent variation are few. In fact, in the final case, it's pretty much 0. This means that if you apply the statistical formula for entropy in the final case, you get 0 entropy, which doesn't actually occur in the real world. This also works for more complicated systems, such that the initial conditions do not come close to the pattern. Increase the range of variation, and it gets even further from the pattern. In fact, in this case, not even close. Once again, reduce the amount of variation below the starting point, and you get closer to the target.
Once again, reduce the amount of variation below the starting point, and you get closer to the target.
Perfectly. This means that the reduction of entropy requires at least some form of target. It doesn't have to be a perfect target, but if you're going to reduce the number
Furthermore,
of
if you eliminate
equivalent
all
states from what they are,
variation,
you at
get the
least
target
need some
perfectly.
form of target. The target can be extremely narrow or quite broad, but as long as the number of equivalent states is reduced, entropy will be reduced and order increased in the process. This principle can be reduced to two statements. The general application of energy in a manner more random than a system will increase the entropy of that system. The general application of energy in a manner less random than a system will decrease the entropy of that system. Any theory of the origin of life must raise the prebiotic chemicals' order and complexity to that of the simplest living cell. To do this, it must apply energy to the system in a manner at least as organized and complex as the simplest living cell. As an illustration, let's take a frog, put it in a blender, and turn on the blender. In a matter of seconds, you will have a blender filled with all the chemical components needed to make a frog in the form of frognog. The frog was converted into frognog, and the entropy of the frognog is much, much greater than the entropy of a frog. The goal of abiogenesis is to convert the frognog back into a frog. Remember, you have all of the chemical components necessary to make a frog. This is the case because it used to be a frog, and all you did was chop it up. But you may say that I'm asking too much, setting the goal of turning it back into a frog. After all, we've also destroyed the DNA needed to make the frog in the first place. Okay, at least convert it into the simplest possible living cell. Even this artificially stripped-down cell that has been produced in a laboratory has way lower entropy than our frognog does. However, the entropy of the frognog is much, much, much greater than the entropy of a single-cell bacteria. The usual explanation is that cells started out simpler without the cellular machinery. But no such organism exists. It is a totally ad hoc effort to keep abiogenesis looking viable. In fact, it actually goes against experiments designed to find out what the simplest possible cell's like. Furthermore, without the cellular machinery to repair itself, a cell's entropy would quickly increase and it would die. What is needed is to evaluate all of the phenomenon that can add energy to prebiotic chemicals and see what could do the job. What follows is just such an evaluation. Heat is one source of energy available to a prebiotic soup. Heat applies energy to a system in a random manner, increasing the entropy of the frognog. Heat is clearly not capable of making life from non-life. All you will get is cooked frognog. Radiation is one source of energy available. So let's take a microwave oven and put our frognog in it, close the door, and turn it on. However, radiation applies energy in a random manner, increasing the entropy of the frognog. Radiation is clearly not capable of making life from non-life. Electrical energy is another source of energy available to a prebiotic soup. So let's take our frognog and put it out in a thunderstorm and let it get struck by lightning. This idea was actually popular at the time that the book Frankenstein was written. However, while electricity applies energy to a system in a less random manner than heat and radiation, it is still more random than frognog, increasing its entropy. Electrical energy is clearly not capable of making life from non-life. Solar energy is one of the sources of energy available to a prebiotic soup. In fact, it is the most commonly suggested source of energy given for the origin of life. If we take our frognog and put it outside with the sun pouring on it. Now, without chlorophyll and the accompanying cellular machinery, there is no mechanism to convert solar energy into useful energy. Without these mechanisms, solar energy gets applied to the system in a random manner, with most of what is absorbed becoming heat, increasing the entropy of the frognog. So solar energy is clearly not capable of making life from non-life. Chemistry is one source of energy that would be available to a prebiotic soup. Unlike others, chemistry can increase the order of a system, reducing its entropy. However, it does not necessarily do so, but increases or decreases entropy depending on the reaction. Chemistry can also use other sources of energy to either increase or decrease entropy. There are two main ways that chemistry can reduce entropy. The first way is by reducing the number of free-moving particles, thus reducing the number of equivalent configurations. It is effectively reducing the size of the system. The other way is that chemical bonds have a geometric order to how they form, so they can produce a degree of order in the atoms. This geometric order more often tends to form simple repetitive patterns like those found in crystals. However, carbon chemistry can form some complex molecules even without life. As a result, it is safe to conclude that chemistry can apply energy in a manner more ordered than Frognog. Thus, the Frognog's entropy can be decreased. However, it needs to be noted that this is not guaranteed, just possible. The larger, more complex organic compounds become, the more unstable they become, in that they tend to break down quickly after being formed. The question is, can chemistry produce life? Does chemistry alone have sufficient organization to produce life from non-life? The answer is no, because life is more than just chemistry. Even the simplest living cell is a complex assembly of information and molecular machines that manufactures, transports, and manipulates large, complex molecules as it needs them. Mechanical energy is also one source of energy available to prebiotic soup. Like chemistry, it can increase the order of a system, reducing its entropy. However, it does not necessarily do so, but increases and decreases entropy depending on the application of mechanical energy. Mechanical energy can be applied as pressure and currents. Currents do possess a degree of order, in that all of the molecules in a fluid are generally moving in the same direction. This has the potential of aligning molecules in less random patterns, affecting the chemistry that can happen. Mechanical pressure can be both destructive and constructive. However, in a chemical environment, there can be mechanical pressures that actually aid the chemistry of long-chain molecules, such as DNA and RNA. In such cases, it does increase the order of the chemistry a little bit beyond what would otherwise occur, but not beyond what is possible by chemistry alone. The result is that the best application of mechanical energy has about the same effect on entropy as can be produced by chemistry. Consequently, by itself, mechanical energy is not sufficient to produce life and non-life. It is at this point that proponents of abiogenesis pull out their ultimate weapon, natural selection. Natural selection is pulled out by evolutionists and waved over the problem like a magic wand that, once invoked, magically fixes all problems, eventually being able to turn Frognog into a frog. A key point of natural selection is that it works only on living organisms. This means it only works on life, making it no help whatsoever with regards to producing life from non-life. Furthermore, natural selection does not actually produce anything. It can only select from traits that already exist, those traits that are best for survival and reproduction in a given environment. As a result, natural selection applies no energy to a system, so it cannot reduce entropy. The simple fact is that natural selection is not a sufficiently ordered process for decreasing entropy. The result is that natural selection cannot overcome the thermodynamic barriers to developing existing cellular machinery. We have examined every way energy can be applied to non-living matter. Heat, radiation, electrical energy, solar energy, chemistry, and mechanical energy all prove too random for abiogenesis to occur. In conclusion, abiogenesis is a thermodynamic impossibility. Living organisms have both the internally stored information and cellular machinery needed to produce other life. Each type of organism has the ability to apply energy to the raw materials of life with a degree of ordered complexity needed to produce more life of the same kind, just as the Bible says. The fact is that the only observed way of producing life is for it to be produced by life, so life can produce life from non-life. However, life cannot be the original origin of life, since no cell can make itself. There is one other known phenomenon that has sufficient ordered complexity to apply energy in a manner of sufficient ordered complexity to produce life. This phenomenon is intelligence. The human mind has a higher degree of ordered complexity than a single living cell. This is true even if the mind is just a product of the brain, since the brain consists of billions of cells wired in a complex ordered network. The fact is that the human mind regularly produces forms of ordered complexity. Scientists have encoded an artificial genome and successfully implanted it into a living cell, thus proving that intelligence can encode a cell's genome. It is not unreasonable to think that unless life on a single cell level requires a spiritual component, the humans will one day develop the technology to artificially build a living cell from scratch. So high enough intelligence would be capable of producing life from non-life. This means that the only known phenomenon that could have originated biological life is intelligence. Given its thermodynamic problems, there's really only one reason to believe in abiogenesis. That is a prior commitment to the philosophy of naturalism. Naturalism discounts all but totally naturalistic explanations for all phenomenon as a starting assumption. Someone with a prior commitment to naturalism must accept abiogenesis regardless of the evidence. This is because naturalism allows no other possibility, because some form of abiogenesis is the only real naturalistic option. So if you hold to naturalism, you have to believe in abiogenesis, even if it requires violating every known law of science. Having demonstrated that abiogenesis is a thermodynamic impossibility, it can no longer be considered a rational scientific theory of the origin of life. The only possibility that fits with thermodynamic principles is an intelligent creator. Furthermore, since our universe had a beginning, this intelligence would have to be from outside our universe, and an intelligence from outside the universe would exist outside time, and thus could be eternal. This means that the real rational scientific theory on the origin of life is creation by a supernatural intelligence. That is God.